Well, I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce our first speaker, Andrew Gelman. Andrew is a professor of statistics and political science at Columbia. He received the Outstanding Statistical Application Award 3 times from the American Statistical Association. He got an award for the best article published at the American Political Science Review and the Council of Presidents of Statistical Societies Award for outstanding contributions by a person under age 40. He's written 6 books. He writes an amazing blog. I encourage you to check it out. His research is on a wide range of topics and statistics, from arsenic in Bangladesh to the predictability of elections. And he's going to talk to us today about the latter. So please go ahead, Andrew.
Okay. Actually, there are some similarities to the problems of arsenic in Bangladesh and forecasting elections. And both of them involve feedback, unintended consequences. In Bangladesh is a low-lying country, and you can pretty much dig anywhere and get water. But a lot of the surface water is contaminated because they keep a lot of animals on the land. There's a lot of bacteria. So a bunch of years ago, some international organizations came in and said, hey, dig deep wells. And then when you dig the deep wells, the water is naturally filtered. If it's coming from 40 feet deep, there aren't going to be any bacteria left. So people were drinking out of the deep wells. And then some people started measuring, and it turned out that there was arsenic in the water in some of the deep wells. Arsenic is one of the most common elements in the Earth's crust, and it's poisonous, but not the way it's usually encountered. But in a few places in the world, it's unbound, and you can actually, when you drink it, it will get into your brain and do bad things to you. So then the international organizations had to go back out and to suggest to people that they dig deeper wells. And our project had to do with how deep you had to dig the well. So it became a spatial statistics problem. Then there's also another concern that if everyone digs deep wells, then somehow it'll mess things up and there's going to be arsenic there. So it's unknown. And as I said, kind of like election forecasting with certain feedback aspects that you don't fully know, although the fact that we're not sure of what's going to happen doesn't mean that we can do nothing. There's been some discussion of election forecasts changing the election outcome. I'm somewhat skeptical of that. It's certainly possible. Like, one reason for my skepticism is after the 1980 presidential election, which some of us remember, the election was called, it was supposed to be a close election, but actually it wasn't close at all. It was called for Ronald Reagan before the polls closed in California. And there was some suggestion that maybe the Democrats did worse in some of the West Coast states because they didn't bother voting because they had already lost. Not clear that someone would bother. Well, it's potentially, it's possible. But then after 2016, some people said that the Democrats weren't voting enough because they were so sure that they were going to win. So it's theoretically possible to have one election where people aren't voting because they think they're going to lose, and another election where they're not voting because they think they're going to win. But it's not completely clear to me that's the case. And worth studying, but we should be aware of that. My personal experience in election forecasting started in the year 1988. And I was working with a colleague, a political science professor. This was when I was at Harvard. And I remember in the fall, like shortly after, well, in the summer, I guess, after the Democratic convention, the Democratic candidate, Michael Dukakis, yeah, there are no slides. Someone asked, where are the slides? I hate slides. The Democratic candidate, Michael Dukakis, was leading in the polls by 15 points. And that kind of number is a little bit of an exaggeration, because leading by 15 points means you're at 57.5% of the two-party vote, which is like, I'd rather say someone was at 57% than say 15 points. But anyway, he was there at 57% of the two-party vote. And my friend said, no, Bush is going to win. And I said, why is that? And he said, oh, well, there's this book by this guy, Stephen Rosenstone, this political scientist, called Forecasting Presidential Elections. It came out a few years ago. And you can forecast elections based on the fundamentals, which is basically the economy and incumbency. And it's the economy is going well, incumbent party running for the incumbent party is going to do well. Dukakis being ahead doesn't really mean anything. Then on election night, I was actually in his office. We were working on election night, and he had a pair of tickets that somebody had given him to the Dukakis celebration party in Boston. So I said, should we go? Like, what if he wins? Like, I was just like, back then, nobody knew anything. I mean, really, it was like, I remember 1984, and it was like, yeah, Reagan's supposed to win, but who knows what's going to happen? We really lived in a state of innocence back then. That it's hard for you to imagine now. Anyway, so I was in this. I said, well, yeah, but like, what do you know? I said, okay, well, let's look at what happened. So then the first state that comes in was Kentucky, I believe, which proposed, and it had Bush winning in Kentucky, and the margin of victory was basically what you would expect his margin of victory would be. So he said, look, given that information, so my colleague was being a little bit Bayesian, maybe without realizing it. And so we didn't go. We didn't waste our time going to the sad party. Now, this experience motivated a research project. So my colleague and I wrote a paper called Why Are American Presidential Campaign Polls So Variable when the election is so predictable? That's kind of a funny question, right? Like, how come the political scientists knew who was going to win? We didn't really know, but the political scientists had a level of certainty and in the rough outcome of the election, and yet the voters didn't know. The polls were jumping all over the place, and it suggested that survey responses are not always to be trusted. That the survey response, no, we always say a poll is a snapshot, not a forecast. The survey question is, how would you vote if the election were held today? So one thought would be that it might be just how the question were asked. If instead of saying, how would you vote if the election were held today, you say, the election's going to be in November, how do you plan to vote? It turns out that doesn't give you better responses. It just gives you more non-response. So uncertainty, non-response is kind of a taste that people have. So some people have a taste for certainty and they become doctors and car repairmen, and some people have a repair people, and some people have a taste for uncertainty and they become statisticians, right? So asking the question differently doesn't really change it. And we finally decided that it took a while for, like, when the election came around, people basically voted on partisanship, although people who are close to the middle might vote based on the economy. But months before the election, people didn't quite realize this themselves. Now things have changed. Polls are much more stable than they used to be. So nowadays, people are always expecting replay of 1988 or similar past elections. But in the past several elections, the polls have been very stable for like the entire campaign. In fact, we looked at this in 2012 and 2016. There were some swings in 2012 and 2016, but most of those swings could themselves be attributed to what we call differential non-response, meaning Republicans being more likely to respond to the poll when it's good news for the Republicans, and Democrats being more likely to respond when it's good news for the Democrats. Not the whole story, but it explains a lot. I think this is related to political polarization. In 1988, it was a lot easier for somebody to say, yeah, I think Dukakis, I'll give that guy a shot. Like, I think he has some good ideas. Nowadays, like, we're kind of all trained to be like, are you kidding? Vote for that guy in the other party. So, like, in some ways, like, when it comes, we know ourselves better than we knew ourselves before. There's also less split ticket voting, and you see kind of some amazing things like that Georgia runoff election where the runoffs for the Senate were almost identical to the presidential vote in the state. Just kind of stunning. You're not always going to see that. Of course, there are other elections, like the election in Maine, where Biden easily won the state, but Susan Collins, the Republican senator, easily won re-election. Voters are not automatons, however, much more predictable than before. Which gets us to the topic of today's talk of predicting elections, forecasting elections. In this project that I told you about, which we started back in 1988, the paper got published in 1993. While we were still kind of working on the paper in 1992. It took a while back then to write papers. And we decided if we're actually going to say elections are so predictable, we should predict the election. So I wrote a little program to predict the presidential election in 1992. I did not use the polls because the whole point of this was that elections could be predicted from fundamentals. So using the polls would be cheating. My goal was not to bet on the election or to figure out who was going to win. Our goal was to establish how well we could predict the election or not, given past information. Who we used, it turned out that things were simple back then. So existing models were either at the national level or the state level. Nobody had done both at the same time. It's not hard. You just do a hierarchical model. So we fit a model with national, state, and regional level error predictors. Not technologically hard now, but it was challenging back in 1992. We also included region indicators based on previous elections. So there was some benefit to the candidate running in their home region, like Walter Mondale doing better in the Midwest, for example. Now, in 1992, Bill Clinton was running and he was from the South. We looked at our prediction before the election and we didn't believe it, partly because there were polls out there. Our prediction said that Clinton would win a whole bunch of southern states, not just Arkansas, but Texas and a bunch of other states. We didn't believe it. I think that being a Southerner is not such a big deal anymore. Even back in 1992, it helped Bill Clinton in the South to be a Southerner, but really it helped George H.W. Bush. Of course, he was sort of a Southerner too. He was living in Texas at the time. And I don't think we gave him credit for that, but also just the South had been moving toward there. My only point is that we were able to interrogate our forecast even before the election, certainly after you can. So I want to make I want to sort of make an argument in favor of forecasting, which I think will be popular in this conference. So I will really happy to make my audience happy. I'm not the kind of person who bites the hand that feeds them a free Zoom talk here. One advantage of forecasting is you put yourself out there and you learn when you're wrong. Now, some people are into betting. I was tempted to bet in the 2020 election back when we were giving Joe Biden a 80 or 90% chance of winning, and the prediction markets were giving Biden like a 60% chance. I was thinking of betting either two ways, either just straight bet or make the bet and then a few weeks later cover it, because I was pretty sure things would shift as they did toward Biden. I didn't do that for three reasons. One is I'm not quite sure how to bet on elections from the US or even whether it's 100% legal. Two was I looked at how much the markets are not very liquid, like months ahead of time. And so I wouldn't have been able to bet much. So it wasn't clear it was worth it just to make 10,000 bucks or whatever. I mean, for $1 million bucks, maybe I'd compromise my principles. Then the other thing was I felt a little bit guilty about it. Like, I mean, the people who bet are like, it's their money. Like, it's not, at the same time, it seemed a little weird to be using my professional knowledge to make money off of some people. No, I wouldn't want to do any insider trading. So if I was going to bet, I would have first posted on the blog, I'm about to bet. Like, I don't want to Like I want people I don't mind bets. Like if people have informed disagreements with me, that's fine. And I'll take their money. But anyway, I felt a little weird. It was some odd combination of feeling a little weird, not knowing if it was legal and not being worth doing for just 10,000 bucks. Didn't bet. But you don't need to bet to commit, right? So, and you don't even need to commit publicly to commit if you commit to yourself. So we learned a lot from this forecasting exercise. When it happened, we did a bunch of other things. I had a talk that I gave where I gave things like, what's the probability the electoral college is an exact tie? What's the probability your vote is decisive? Lots of like fun things. I feel like we were ahead of our time because nobody cared about that stuff back then. Now everyone wants these things. Like in the 2000s, people really got into it, but I could not convince anybody to say, why should you care whether which state is going to be decisive and stuff like that. We had all these fun probability calculations. So after that, I talked to my collaborator and I said, hey, let's do this again. This was fun. Like the only reason we did the forecast was for the paper. It was purely that. Like, let's do this. Let's do it in 4 years. Let's get in the New York Times. Like I was young. I wanted publicity, like very naive again. And he said, no, we shouldn't do that. And I said, why? And he said, asymmetric loss. And I said, what do you mean? And he says, if you forecast it right, that's great. You get a little benefit. You get a small amount of fame. Isn't that wonderful? People listen to you a little more. And if you get it wrong, then you look like an idiot and you destroy your reputation. And so don't do it. So I thought, I guess you're right. Didn't do it for a long time. In 2016, I publicized somebody else's forecast, but I didn't really look at it in detail myself. I wrote about a forecast and I said, this forecasting approach is the wave of the future, but I didn't look at it in detail. 2020, I was contacted by a journalist from The Economist magazine, Elliot Morris, and they were doing a presidential election forecast, adapting a model, Fit and Stan, our computer program, the one that I had publicized a few years ago by Pierre Kremp, which in turn was based on a model by political scientist Drew Linzer, which in turn was related to a paper that I wrote in, I think, 2010 about election forecasting by states, which in turn was based on some stuff we had done earlier. So there's lots of stuff going on. And then I said, okay, let's do it. I'm ready. I have no reputation left to lose. So we did it. And I wrote this paper with Jessica Holman, who's a computer scientist, and Chris Vlasian, who's a political scientist, about what was going on. And I think the difference in our paper compared to other things is we were not trying to sell what we were doing. It was more like it's more that we're trying to be open about our struggles. Now I only have like 3 seconds left, so I don't have a chance to go into all that. You can read the paper. I'll say a couple of things that we did use polls. We used state polls and national polls. Some people have kind of funny, almost superstitious attitudes about state polls and national polls, like you should only use state polls, you should only use national polls. Polls are survey responses. They're all just people. Calling it a state poll or calling it a national poll doesn't make it better or worse. Now, put together a bunch of state polls, you have a national poll, you look at a national poll within each state, you have a state poll. So we use both sources of information. We did allow for there to be systematic polling error. And we've done some new research in systematic polling error since the election, which I don't have time to share with you. But I will say it was a good thing we allowed for systematic polling error because there was systematic polling error. The result we had, like our prediction interval for the election outcome was that Biden was going to get something like between like 250 and 450 electoral votes. It was pretty wide, and he actually got 306. It was inside the interval, but it was lower than the center of the interval. And there are lots of discussion about how to communicate this. I felt very strongly that I did not want to go and say we got 49 states correct, and so therefore our forecast was great. I mean, getting it correct, most of the states you're going to get correct no matter what, and then some of the others are pretty random anyway. So when we say we got 49 states correct, it's more like you could say we got 9 out of 10 close states correct, which is kind of it's kind of good, but it's also kind of lucky. there's perhaps of most interest to the audience here has to do with incentives in presenting forecasts. Forecasts are presented by news organizations. As I said, the polls are stable, the fundamentals are stable. We thought back in May, or April, we thought Biden was going to get about 54% of the two-party vote, and we had some uncertainty. As of November, we thought he was going to get 54.5% of the two-party vote, and we had a little bit less uncertainty. As it was, he got, I think, around 52% of the two-party vote. So, like, nothing much happened, except like the polls were off by a bit, which is one of these things that would have been hard to. There was some information about, but it would have been hard to know. There wasn't much news happening during the campaign. News organizations are supposed to give news, so it's a kind of a challenge. Sometimes there's an incentive to create dramatic forecasts or changes in the forecasts in order to supply news. Conversely, there's some incentive for underconfidence. So there have been some forecasters who gave very wide uncertainty intervals. There was a forecaster we wrote about that said that that Trump had a chance of winning California. They gave this forecaster gave Biden a 6% chance of winning in South Dakota. 6%'s a little high. You never know, but it's a little high. And I think that's because of the loss function that I talked about earlier. You have this loss function, which is that if you get it wrong, you look really embarrassed. So there's an incentive to get a very wide interval. I think, yeah, I think in retrospect, perhaps I think the forecasts serve a useful function. I think that they are not going to be perfect. It's not clear what a perfect forecast would mean. I think it's good for if possible, for a forecast to be based on open information so that problems with the forecast can be assessed going forward and we can learn from our mistakes. So I think there's time for a couple questions now.
Great, thank you so much, Andrew. I'll clap and everyone else is clapping, although you can't hear. Really, really interesting, thank you. So yeah, now we have some time for questions. If you have a question, you can type it in the Q&A box and I will read it to Andrew. We have one question already. Eric asks, do most polls weight by party registration? And if that's true, how does that non-response affect the top line numbers?
Okay, well, first, I would just like to say, like, I like to speak of surveys adjusting rather than weighting. Weighting is a particular technique for adjusting. So to say weighting is like saying you Xerox something rather than saying you photocopied it. The answer is that some polls adjust for party identification. Polls adjust in different ways. There are polls of registered voters, and they do sometimes adjust for party registration. Polls also ask party identification, and sometimes they adjust for that. They don't always, though. Some do and some don't. In our model, we allowed for a systematic difference between polls that adjusted for party and didn't adjust for party. So our forecasting model, actually, our forecasts were stable because of that. So the problem in 2020 was that even polls that adjusted for party registration were still off on average by a couple percentage points. But I do think it was bad. The polls that did adjust for party registration were more stable. So that is a step forward.
Okay, great. And Bo would like to ask a question. He's on the panel, so he can ask it verbally.
Thanks. Yeah, I requested to abuse my position here.
Yeah.
I have a two-part question. The first is, can we evaluate these forecasts? So, if you flip a coin once every 4 years, there's just no meaningful way to evaluate accuracy, but is there enough power here to actually evaluate? And the second is around accountability. So it seems to me like forecasters and pollsters like to push accountability back and forth. So how do we make sure that forecasts have some?
Well, I think, it's actually kind of funny because I wrote something after the election saying, like, like, don't kid yourselves, like, the polls were off. And like, we did allow for polling error, but still we have to be aware. And I was very clear. It was funny because I was very clear that like it was my problem too. Like, I'm a pollster too. And then someone sent me something where someone wrote, "Oh, there he is passing the buck, blaming the pollsters." It's like, no, like, I'm not, because that, like, I was going into this wide open. I wrote a paper a few years ago saying that the polls are off systematically, and we use the polls in our forecast. So no, like, it's not like buck passing. I guess all I'll say, this isn't really going to answer your question, but all I'll say is that for many purposes, polls aren't too bad. Like, being off by 2% points is pretty good for a lot of things. So most of the uses of polls are marketing research. And so if 63% of people will do something or say they'll do something rather than 61%, it probably doesn't matter so much. It's these close elections where it becomes more important.
Great. Another question from Grant. He says, well, you mentioned two different types of incentive. There's an incentive like to say something dramatic and get news about it. So, but there's also the incentive you mentioned, like if you get it wrong, you especially get pilloried, I guess. So can you say how like this different incentive affects different people differently?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we wrote about it and I'm not sure. I don't think the incentives cancel each other out. I do know that when we did our thing for The Economist, we could feel it happening. Like, you could like kind of almost physically feel yourself being pulled around. So like, we had this, like, here it is, our forecast for, like, this is our forecast for the election. We have Biden with an 85% chance of winning. Do we really believe that? What does that mean? I think it's very hard, like, to develop. It's not clear, like, what these statements even mean. Like, I mean, of course, I know mathematically what it means to say someone has an 85% chance, but like, it's this one election. I'm kind of thinking that instead of giving that percentage win number, it would be better to give an interval forecast conditional on the national polling error. So to decompose it. So to say we think the national polling error could be in the range, it's most likely to be in the range plus or minus 3%, probably less than that. Given the national polling error, what would be the forecast? And it's not just the polls, it is the fundamentals. Like, when Biden was there at 54%, like, well, could he have got 51%? Yeah, I guess he could have got 51%. He didn't get 51%. I guess that would have caused him to lose the national election. Could he have got 57%? Well, 57% is a lot in the age of political polarization. Maybe not. It's kind of easy to say that. Like, on the other hand, I guess it's possible. Like, if you can't like, at some point you kind of get to the end of your rope, and like, what happens. Like, as I said, like, I was criticizing some other forecasts because at one point they said that Trump might get 58% of the vote in Florida, and I don't think he really ever had a chance of doing that in some way. So like, there is a way. One of the advantages of getting 50 state forecasts is that there's like more ways of saying silly things. So the forecast that allowed Trump to win California or New Jersey, or that said he might get 58% of the vote in Florida, I think that forecast had its correlations between state forecasts were too low. So it needed a very wide uncertainty in state forecasts in order to get kind of what seemed like the right national uncertainty. So maybe that's maybe my only advice is that, like, yes, you can produce a top line number, but look at what goes inside of it also, because there's a lot more interesting ways of going wrong that way.
Okay. Great. Well, there is one more question, but I think
I
in the,
can answer. Eric wrote,
Go ahead.
why do you suspect that the difference between you and the forecaster you mentioned is driven by incentives rather than honest disagreement? I mean, it's not incentives or disagreement, like incentives push you in a certain way. So like I think we had similar incentives, like no, we all had an incentive to not look foolish. And so it's well-known advice in the judgment decision-making literature to widen your confidence intervals, your uncertainty intervals. It's not that there were different incentives. I think the other forecaster had like different technologies. Our forecasts had issues too, but I think they kind of had different technologies in terms of models they were using. And so maybe, they ended up kind of messing up in some ways, and we maybe ended up messing up in other ways, having to do with the tools that we were using. I don't think it was so much a disagreement or uncertainty though.
All right. Well, great. Thank you, Andrew.